So today I'd like to deal briefly, quickly, to actually a big subject and to show you several pictures, maybe too many of them, I don't know, but only to give an idea of the way it works when you deal with what we call Indianization, the fact that Indian art and civilization deeply influenced Southeast Asia from at least the first centuries of this era. So here we begin with a map and several serious material, just to make sure that everybody will stick to the subject, to recall you the different ways that this influence has been made from India to Far Eastern countries and Southeast Asia. Of course, the most important way to link the two countries was the sea, actually. For centuries, the coastal relationships between the countries have been the most important ways, actually, to deal with connections between India, even from the western side of India, until the south of China. Commercial relationship and, of course, cultural relationship. But you see also some very, very schematic, I'm sorry about that, but it's only to give an idea of the things, of course, the roads in mainland Asia that could also link Western countries, the north of India, to China. But actually many routes are missing in this map. For instance, coming from the south of China or Central Asia, the southern part of Central Asia and south of China, to the north of nowadays Vietnam, Laos, Thailand and Burma, that is to say Myanmar today. And many things could be traced back thanks to a better knowledge of these routes that have always been under considered. The presence of an Indian influence can be traced back thanks to the finding of inscriptions. And of course I won't deal with that subject with you today, but I just wanted to recall you this huge monolithic inscription looking like a megalith, actually, which is now preserved in the garden of the Museum of Vietnamese History in Hanoi, and which is dating back to now, it seems to be, because it changes almost every 2 years, when you look at the publications of the epigraphists on the subject. So for the moment, it should be late 4th century. The latest studies on these stela were made by Arlo Griffiths, who is among the best scholars in this field, able to translate Sanskrit, but also old versions of the scripture. And here he was able to mention that it was a southern Brahmi inscription, that is to say, an inscription influenced by South India, the lower half of the subcontinent, and this inscription remains problematic. We find names of kings. Translators are not even sure about the fact the inscription could be Buddhist or Hindu, but what is sure is that kings at that time in what is central southern part of Vietnam had some Indian names and could write or ask people to write texts in Sanskrit for them with a religious purpose. When one deals with this question of relationship between India and Southeast Asia, it is of course very important also to mention a key part, because I will only deal with the early period, of course, today with you. And the key part of this relationship is here, actually, is in the middle of the Malay Peninsula, close to Suratthani province in the south of Thailand, not far from the border, the northern border of Malaysia, and close to the city of Chaya, for instance. Why is that part so important, that part of the world, of the Southeast Asian world, so important? For a simple reason. When you look at the map, which is the fact that one day someone having coastal relationship from India to Southeast Asia or from Southeast Asia to India realized that it took a long time and it was very dangerous to go around the southern part of the Malay Peninsula, and in fact the two sides of the coast were very, very close by. So it was easier to stop there and to have a walk throughout the mountain and go to the other side of the Malay Peninsula and go on with the coastal shipment. So when this was discovered, and we don't know exactly when it was actually, of course, but because we have no historical record for that, but when it was done, this part of Southeast Asia became very important because it was like a carrefour between, I don't know if I can say that in English, in French English, but anyway, you see what I mean, cross line between countries and worlds actually. And you will see that, why is it important? Alors, when one deals with Buddhism in Southeast Asia, we can trace back its presence thanks to objects, of course, and I will show you many of them, but also thanks to inscriptions. And some very interesting ones and very precious ones, but fragile and most of the time stolen, even in museums, such as these ones, which once belonged to the Long An Museum in South Vietnam, but were recently, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, were stolen there, are small inscriptions that were put inside the pedestals of the Buddhist images. And some of them have some iconographic elements. Here we find only elephants. And also inscriptions in Sanskrit, in Prakrit, that is to say a mixture of Pali and Sanskrit, or in Pali. These three languages used to diffuse the Buddhist sutras. And here you have the famous Buddhist text that you find in many sculptures or stelas dealing with how the Buddha was able to find the way. Of course, the big images made in India in stone could not travel when monks and merchants, to reuse a well-known title of an incredible exhibition dealing with these kind of things, but between India and China. These big sculptures or big stone objects could not travel. What traveled were books, sutras, and also small objects, substitutes of the most important sculptures, keeping the vision of how Buddhist temples could deal with Buddhist iconography from time to time. And here you have an example of them found in Central Asia, in Kucha, objects belonging to the collection of Musée Guimet, dating back to the 6th to 7th century, which were portative altars. So very small, very light, you could put them in your luggage and pray for your personal devotion, and of course, give it to someone abroad much more easily than with a stone sculpture. And some of them seem to have traveled along very long distance. For instance, this well-known Tang Dynasty portative altar kept in the Kongobuji temple of Japan. Actually, in Southeast Asia, several Chinese objects including Buddhist iconographies, were found also because you understood, thanks to the map I showed in the introduction, that Southeast Asia is precisely in the middle of the road linking India to South China. It's self-evident when one thinks of the term Indochina, but it's important to recall it from time to time. Here you have a small bronze sculpture found in Ok Eo, a very important place in South Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta, which once was a Khmer city where the commercial relationship between Malay Peninsula, South China, and India were very important. And we found this object in the 1930s. And actually, it is there in the Mekong Delta that you find many of the most impressive objects, and some of them may be some of the most ancient Buddhist art objects in Southeast Asia. But this is still to be discussed because the datation of this object is not that easy, as it is most of the time for Buddhist iconography, actually. And these objects were found, I said, in the Mekong Delta, in Binh Hoa and Thap Moi, in the two provinces of Long An and Dong Thap, that is to say, nowadays, South Vietnam, but that was Cambodia in that time, actually. One of them is here on the screen. It's the biggest one, more than 2 meters high. It's preserved in the Museum of Vietnamese History of Ho Chi Minh City. And the Musée Guimet was able to work together with that museum to help the Vietnamese colleagues in renovating these galleries, and the pictures were taken at the time of the reopening of the galleries, which are still very well preserved, I must say. Incredible sculpture, not only because of the size, but because of the material. It's a wooden sculpture, which is very rare for Southeast Asia. As you know, the climate and the condition, the specific condition of the soil, so acid, doesn't allow the preservation of wooden material. Another object, a little bit smaller, maybe of 1 meter, 50 centimeters, something like that, including the pedestal, is this beautiful object found not far away from the former one, but keeping a much better condition. The big one looks like more or less a Giacometti sculpture nowadays, but it's a very impressive one. This one has kept much more of its genuine sculpture. It has been dated between the 6th century of this era to the 8th century, and it's a problem to be more sure about that, actually, even now. And well, I must say I wouldn't dare to say something more precise about it. But what is interesting for us today is to understand how these relationships and these influences work. You know, Southeast Asia, or even China, was not invaded by India, of course. The relationships were very diffuse, if I can say that in English, but anyway. They took a long time, and they were made thanks to many people, many merchants, monks, people traveling for whatever the reason. And so all of these Southeast Asian objects bear many kinds of influence. And it would be wrong to consider that there is an Indian model, a classical model, which developed in Southeast Asia in a very specific way. Actually, when you look at the nowadays Vietnamese sculpture, but once Khmer sculpture of Binh Hoa in the left side, and when you compare it to the well-known Gupta images of the 5th century of this era, you have the Sarnath school, very well known because of the beauty, the softness of the sculpture, and the fact that the costume has no pleats and is sticking to the body. The same thing that you have here in Binh Hoa. So you could say, well, this is influenced by northern India. But at the same time, the position and particularly the way the costume is sculpted, it is not so obvious with my picture here. I'm sorry about that, but you must trust me or go to Ho Chi Minh City and see the object, which what takes a little bit more time, of course, but anyway, the costume is much more linked with the Amaravati tradition. So it's interesting to see that we find in this kind of object northern and southern Indian traditions influenced together in a new creation. So it's an adaptation of several kinds of influences. Of course, I said the stone objects could not travel. Wooden objects could have traveled, for sure, but as far as I know, we have not found any evidence of an Indian wooden sculpture found in Southeast Asia, but we have some bronzes that were found in Southeast Asia. Not these ones. The ones you have here on the screen come from India itself. Are they preserved in the United States, Pasadena or New York, or in the Birmingham Museum? It is the Sultanganj incredible bronze. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's the nicest Gupta bronze image that was ever discovered. But in Southeast Asia, the same kind of iconographies and techniques have been found here and there. For instance, this Buddha image from the Banu Bandhu Yugala collection, which is now preserved in the National Museum of Bangkok. But I was never able to see it myself. It was not on display for many times, so I only took the pictures from Boisselier's book. We find not only wooden sculptures dating back to the maybe late 6th up to the early 8th century, as I said before, but also stone sculpture. For instance, in Chavin province, this beautiful Buddha image that was on display in this very museum, actually several years ago, when my colleague Myriam Lambrecht curated a huge and the first exhibition on the arts of Vietnam here in the Musée Royal d'Art et d'Histoire. And she was able to show this beautiful sculpture from Ho Chi Minh City, which is a Khmer sculpture of the Mekong Delta linked with Phnom Penh sculptures. I will deal with that very, very soon. And we have the same kind of image, but much smaller and in less good condition, let's say, in Musée Guimet, but coming from the same time of excavations in Vietnam. And there too, you find exactly the same connections with Gupta art or the art of South India, a mixture of both traditions, so not the exact copy of a specific tradition. And another object I wanted to show you today from that very large ensemble of Buddhist sculptures on the Mekong Delta is a less known sculpture because today its actual condition doesn't permit anyone to realize its importance and quality. It's what we said to be the Cap Saint-Jacques Buddha. Vung Tau is the Vietnamese term for this specific place I just showed on the map, the Cap Saint-Jacques, Vung Tau in Vietnamese. And it's preserved in a Vietnamese Buddhist modern pagoda. So in the 30s, it was still like this when it was published by a French scholar dealing with Buddhist iconography of the 6th century because it bears many influences with the Gupta Indian art. And we have a head belonging to exactly the same style that was considered to be a fake for a long time. So we were dealing recently with the question of the quality of objects in museums, for instance, the Japanese prints that you just mentioned. We have the same kind of thing. This head was linked to nothing. It couldn't be Indian, it couldn't be Khmer. So what was it? It was nothing. So it was in storage for more than 50 years. And suddenly it was possible to check its provenance and to realize that it was deeply linked with Southeast Asian sculptures such as this beautiful image of Vung Tau. Beautiful indeed, and maybe nicer now thanks to the marvelous restoration that was made by the Buddhist monks in charge of the Vietnamese pagodas. So of course it is a little bit difficult to realize the quality of the sculpture. But it's important in another way because we must all have in mind that what we see is archaeological material. And the question of the gilding and the painting of the sculptures has to be kept in our mind. So maybe it's a little bit too obvious here on that example, but anyway, it's important for that. And the reverse could be said, with another famous sculpture, now famous, but not known for many years, from Phnom Penh National Museum. It is this statue coming from Wat Kompong Luong in Angkor Borei. Angkor Borei used to be a big city, a very important city of Preangkorian period, Cambodia, in the 6th to 7th centuries. And this sculpture was preserved since the 30s in the Museum of Phnom Penh, but it was not on display because, this is where Angkor Borei is, sorry, because it was considered to be a statue of a later period. And when there were some changes in the galleries in the 90s, this image was added to a new post-Angkorian Buddhist gallery that was designed at that time in the museum. And it was maybe the masterpiece of the post-Angkorian object, as you can see it here. But thanks to the workshop of conservation in Phnom Penh National Museums, conservators began to clean a little bit the statue, and cleaning it, they realized that there were many, many layers of modern painting, which was not gold leaf, but modern painting. So they wanted to remove that. There was, a committee with several curators in Phnom Penh dealing with that question. Do we have to do that or no? And they began to do that because of the bad quality of the painting. And actually, when they removed the modern painting, the sculpture was not anymore a post-Angkorian image, but a very early image of the 6th century Preangkorian Cambodia. And that is interesting because it bears many relationships with the statues I just showed coming from the Mekong Delta and influenced by Gupta art or later Gupta art, that is to say the Vakataka dynasty, for instance, which deeply influenced many parts of Southeast Asia because of the proportion of the Buddha himself, his power, his energy, and the position also of the hands. Stylistically, it is obviously linked to Khmer art of 6th to 7th century, what we call Phnomda style, because the most important temple where these images were recovered came from Phnomda Hill in the south of nowadays Cambodia. You can see that with the comparison between the two faces. On the right you have Krishna image, so a Hindu image, and the Buddha, the detail of the Buddha head. So it's obvious that they bear the same proportion, the same stylistic relationship. They were probably made actually by the same sculptors, or actually the same workshop in Angkor Borei, as it was always the case. The relationship between religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, have always been very deep, maybe deeper in the early period, but still after that, we should not think that there was no connection between workshops and monks or Brahmins. No, not at all. Everybody, if I can say that, worked more or less together. And I was mentioning the proportions and the gesture, and all that is very linked to Andhra Pradesh art, such as sculpture that we can find in Nagarjunakonda or in Panigiri, for instance. Here you have two examples of these famous iconographies. But one more time, what is interesting is here you have the contrary that I mentioned before, the fact that proportions and gestures belong to this southeastern part of India, but the costume is designed more or less like a northern or northwestern Indian traditions. So you see, it's obvious that this relationship were not so direct, and that it gave the possibility for the local artists to develop their own taste and traditions. Here you have also the comparison between the Wat Kompong Luang and one of the small Buddha in the upper part of the cave number 19 of Ajanta, the famous Buddhist caves, of course, some of them of late Gupta or Vakataka period, such as this one. And in the Mekong Delta, you can find few of them, but several interesting objects that are like unicum. Items showing iconographies that you find in India, but you will not find in Southeast Asia, except for very rare elements, such as this small stone Buddha image showing the Buddha seated, as we said, in the European way, but actually it's not only the European way, but never mind, you see what I mean, with the two legs down to the earth, as if he was on a throne or a chair. And you can find that in several bronzes or in Dvaravati art in stone sculpture, but for Vietnam, nowadays Vietnam or Cambodia, it's the only object where you can find that specific iconography. And there too, you have stylistic relationship with the Phnom Penh style, that is to say, this very important Preangkorian style of late 6th, early 7th century. And the position of the Buddha himself, not only the question of the legs, but also of the left hand, can be linked one more time with Andhra Pradesh traditions. I have no time to go on with that, but it's only to give you the feeling of how all this works together. But of course, these images were first, or maybe in the most spectacular way, sculpted in Ajanta or in Sarnath, that is to say in a northern or western tradition in India. And here you see the same position, the same sculpture, the same costume, sorry, even if the gestures are not exactly corresponding. And it's not only with the Buddha images that you find this kind of strong, but at the same time hard to explain relationship between India and Southeast Asia. You can find that in many Bodhisattva images. Of course, you're all aware with the iconography, these holy people who began to be so important throughout the development of Mahayana Buddhism. And here we have in the collection of Musée Guimet one of our masterpieces, if I may say, which is the Lokeshvara Bodhisattva, found in Tan Long, in nowadays South Vietnam, but it used to be Cambodia in late 6th, early 7th century. The sculpture is related to what I said as being the Phnom Penh style. We have another masterpiece of the kind, the Haryara, a Hindu sculpture of that period, coming from the Phnom Penh colline, the hill itself, and so it's like the key object to understand the stylistic relationship between all these Khmer sculpture found in the south of Cambodia, of nowadays Cambodia, and dating back to the late 6th, early 7th century. These are details of the sculpture to remind you the beauty of the hairstyle. And these large curly hair, designed as perruque. I don't know how you say that, I forgot. But anyway. Okay, so you know what it is. So, very well, thank you so much. And you find that, of course, one more time, in the Gupta tradition. And it's direct link from that, thanks to the help of the Vakataka of Madhya Pradesh, of course. And here you have an example of that with the famous bas-reliefs from Deoghar in Uttar Pradesh, where you have these people who are just in the lower part of a huge bas-relief showing the reclining Vishnu at the time when Vishnu was resting between two worlds, actually. But you know the iconography. And naturally, the prototypes of these beautiful Bodhisattva Lokeshvara, designed as young male figure, slightly smiling, very gentle, with a beautiful body and all the qualities and many garments and so on, is coming one more time from the Gupta art that is obvious when you look at the masterpiece of the masterpiece from New Delhi National Museum. Of course, you can understand the relationship, but realize also the difference of interpretation between the two sculptures and the fact that Khmer people were less interested in the movement, but more interested in making sculptures in the round than Indian people were actually. And this is something very interesting to mention, the fact that in India most of the statues kept put together with a back slab to strengthen them, and in Southeast Asia very early they began to deal with sculpture in the round. And why? Probably because what they had to compare were not stone sculpture coming from India, but bronze or wooden sculpture. So these sculptures did not need any back slab or anything. So of course, when people said, you know, we have that in India, but they are much bigger and made in stone, we can imagine, maybe pure suggestion, but why not, that people in Southeast Asia wanted to do the same in stone and so big as they did in India, but trying to do that in the round as the wooden or the metal objects were made. Here you have a closer relationship to see the question of not only the hairstyle, but the position of the Buddha itself, which is rather interesting. But as I said in my introduction, there is a key part in the map of Southeast Asia, which is that Surat Thani province, Chaya city, South Thailand, northern Malaysia. And we can see actually there how this Indian influence was already transformed into something a little bit different, and how it could then travel also to what was Cambodia at that time, or even the rest of the countries, nowadays Thailand or Vietnam. And one of the most important objects to show that is this Lokeshvara found in Chaya and preserved in the National Museum of Bangkok in Thailand, because it bears a very interesting iconography dating back also to the Gupta period, of course. For instance, here you have the hairstyle, of course, you know, the beauty pleats of the neck, but also the presence of antelope skin on the left shoulder of the Bodhisattva that you can see on both images. And what is interesting is that the softness of these sculptures from Surat Thani provinces maybe have influenced the way Khmer people began to show Bodhisattvas in a very gentle and sweet way, such as this one. And we have in Guimet's collection actually a very small head, but very interesting to me, which is the one you have on the left side of the screen, a Maitreya, if what is in the hairstyle is really a stupa, but it's so small that it's not so sure, but anyway, let's call him Maitreya, which bears a jata, that is to say a hairstyle, which is close to this Surat Thani image. And it's interesting to see that it was in South Cambodia, that is to say, to the part of the country that was much more linked with the sea connections and the commercial relationship, that you can find this kind of much deeper influence from Cambodia from South Thailand, Chaya and Surat Thani province, to Cambodia. The detail of the two objects, I think it makes things obvious. I don't have to say anything. So, and actually, it's only in the 8th century that all these iconography and all these stylistic influences became more rigid, if I may say that, in Cambodia, more formal maybe, and which will be organized in what we called afterwards stylistic periods. But it was not designed like that, of course, during the 8th century, for instance, for the Tolpratit Buddha. But the Khmerization of sculpture becomes obvious in the 8th century onward. This Buddha image we have in the collection, which is very important at the same time because it bears an important inscription in a mixture of Pali and Prakrit, exactly the same inscription, such as the one I showed in the introduction, written on gold and found in South Vietnam, here in Tuol Pratat, central part of nowadays Cambodia, it's exactly the same credo, what we say the credo, the Buddhistic credo. And when I was mentioning the Khmerization of the art and the fact that suddenly it seems that in the 8th century, because probably of the political situation of the country, things become to be more centralized. The stylistic questions, the proportions of the statues seem to come from a main workshop dealing with other less important workshop as, you know, the workshop giving all of it, proportions and so on. And so it becomes more obvious to add objects or to unify objects into stylistic period. But sometimes it's not so easy. One instance here, this beautiful Lokeshvara from unknown provenance, preserved in Philadelphia Museum of Art, a huge sculpture, beautiful. Here you have the details of the head with a hairstyle and a Buddha image on it. And of course, it has been compared to a well-known sculpture of National Phnom Penh Museum, Cambodia, the Harihara from Prasat Andet, which is maybe the most famous ancient sculpture of Cambodia, which is dating back to late 7th century, early 8th century. So it was considered to be a Khmer image of that period. But of course, when you look closely at the way the eyes are designed, because of course, I didn't say that, sorry, but the relationship are clear when one look at the proportion of the face, the nose, the way the mouth and the moustache are designed, the size and the long size of the, I forgot that, but anyway, the eyebrow, yes, sorry, thank you. But at the same time, when you look at the eyes, for instance, or the nose also, it is a little bit different, and it seems to belong to a quite a slightly different tradition, maybe not so Khmer, and it's interesting to link it to some other kind of material that we are familiar with now, and that we will deal with now very shortly. That is to say, Buddhist sculptures of the same period, late 5th, probably only 6th to 7th, 8th century, found in nowadays central Thailand or the border of nowadays Cambodia or the coastal aspect of nowadays Prachinburi province in Thailand, and that were unified together in what was called the Dvaravati kingdom. The Dvaravati kingdom is more or less an invention, but a very useful invention, actually, invented when coins were found here and there in central parts of Thailand bearing the name of Sri Dvaravati Punya. And so it was considered to be the name of a kingdom. That makes sense, actually. But the records of that kingdom, or that, let's say, mixture of several small cities acting together like, I don't know, a common cultural relationship, but being separated here and there and not unified in a very specific way, could be called as a Dvaravati kingdom. And when you look at, one more time, the mouth, but also the nose, and probably more obvious with the eyes of these two sculptures, you can see very strong relationship. And I wouldn't be surprised if these Philadelphia Lokeshvara wouldn't come from nowadays Thailand. Was it Khmer or Mon? Doesn't matter, because sometimes it's absolutely impossible to check what was the border between the Khmer world, nowadays Cambodia, and the Mon world. You know, Dvaravati kingdom belonged to Mon people, so people linked with the Khmer, but not exactly the same language. And we don't know actually where the border was. Was there even a border? I wouldn't be surprised if it would have worked a little bit, if I dare say that here in Belgium, in some parts of this very country, where people speak French, and then you cross the street and people speak Flemish, and you are in the same country. And sometimes it's not divided in an administrative way, exactly the same way people deal with the language. So I close that question. But anyway, a very important image that I wanted to show you for another reason. I should have said that when I showed the beautiful inscription on our Tol Pratat Buddha, but there is also the question of what kind of Buddhism was arrived in Southeast Asia. Was it only Mahayana Buddhism? It is true that we find a lot of Bodhisattva images, but Bodhisattva doesn't mean necessarily Mahayana Buddhism, actually. And here, well, when I showed, the Tol Pratat Buddha images, I should have mentioned the fact that the Pali inscriptions, because it's a mixture of Pali and Prakrit, but mostly Pali, seems to be related to Hinayana Buddhism. So maybe this sculpture too was related to Hinayana Buddhism, as it shows the historical Buddha at the time when he is victorious from Mara, but you know that better than I do, of course. And one more time, what is interesting here, and I have no time left to deal with that, of course, I know, is the fact that it is another way to deal with that Indian influence. And sometimes, when you know exactly the provenance of an object, you can say, oh yes, of course, obviously, it belongs to the Dvaravati tradition. But I can tell you that sometimes it's not so obvious. And having been able to see objects in the storage of Phnom Penh or of Bangkok National Museum or in Nakhon Pathom, for instance, many times I said to myself, well, if that was on the market, what would I say about its provenance, actually? Maybe I would have considered it to be a Khmer one or a Mon one, so Dvaravati or Preangkorian period. Sometimes it's not as obvious as it is here with these beautiful stylized eyes, very deeply linked, related to the Dvaravati tradition. You find that again on this beautiful Wat Napamen Buddha of Ayutthaya. And interesting also because this Dvaravati image, so early image, 6th to 7th century, maybe early 8th century, not sure, is preserved in a temple of Ayutthaya. Why? Because Siamese king kept a strong interest to their own history, for all of their history, I should say. So they traveled with objects all the time, and it's very interesting to check where ancient sculptures, such as this one, were sent to several capital cities. I wouldn't be surprised if this was in Sukhothai city before traveling to Ayutthaya city after that. But anyway, I have no time to deal with these questions, but which makes things more difficult at the same time, because the provenance doesn't mean the genuine provenance of the object, but it means that it was found there, and so what? It could have traveled. And it's the same for the bronzes, of course, because they travel much more, and we find many of these so-called Dvaravati bronzes here and there throughout Southeast Asia, and sometimes in Vietnamese temples. I have seen some of them. So that's very interesting to mention that. Not to mention the fact that in Siam, traditions went on and on and on. And here you have Buddhist images considered to be of the Dvaravati period, that is to say the earliest Buddhist period of Siam, before Siam, of course, but which were found in the Wat Rat Purana treasury of Ayutthaya, that is to say a treasury closed in 1424. So it is very, very late. So what does that mean? These images were kept in families, were refound in Ayutthaya when they built temples, and they found the objects in the ground, and so they wanted to add them to the treasury of the temple. We have no record to explain all of these things, but many of what I just briefly said could have happened and probably did in many, many different ways. And the same could be said with Champa, actually. And I would like to say that it's worse with Champa, or it's more interesting. It depends on the side the way you want to look at it, because, and I put that ugly image full of too many things on the screen, because I wanted to recall the fact that Champa was something a little bit more difficult than Dvaravati, for instance, or even Preangkorian Cambodia. Champa has never been a country, actually. It's, you know, the union of small kingdoms, cities, powerful from time to time, one trying to dominate the others, and so on. Very interesting stories. And so the Cham art itself reflects many kinds of influence, and it's more obvious also because of the position of the country. Well, I use the term country, excuse me about that, but well, it's more comfortable because, as you know, Champa once was developed in the coastal areas of nowadays Vietnam, from, let's say, the Quang Binh province, so in the north, Dai Hu, for instance, here, and My Duc, some important Buddhist sites of late 9th centuries, you have the images here, down to what was Panduranga, that is to say, nowadays Binh Thuan and Ninh Thuan province, and you have these images coming from the lower part, the southern part of Vietnam. And in the middle, a very important one, Dong Duong, where I would just like to show you some images. And so in Champa, dealing with that material is a pure nightmare or a pure dream for an art historian, because you have to check what was existing at the time, here and there, throughout Southeast Asia, India and South India. And for instance, when one looks at this very unusual Lokeshvara, well, it's a very usual one when you look at when you consider the iconography. 4 arms, a Buddha in the jata, standing, you know, all the attributes and everything. But when you consider the style, it is so odd. You don't imagine how uncomfortable felt the people who found these objects in the 1930s during French archaeological excavations. And actually, it's more interesting when you compare them, not to Southeast Asian material, but to South Indian and Sri Lankan material. But these objects, I show 2 of them on the right side of the screen, were much more published, well known, only after World War II in the late 50s, 60s and 70s. So it took time to be able to look at the comparison. And it's interesting to see the links between some aspects of Cham art in the bronze, for instance, with Sri Lanka. And it's not so strange when one considers the importance of the Cham people as being sailors, maritime people. You know that the king of Siam kept a team of Cham people to deal with his own boats in Siam. So that gives an idea of the importance of Cham people when one look at their relationship in the sea, in the maritime world. And actually, they probably come from, well, we're not sure, but maybe Borneo, Sumatra. They are linked to Austronesian people, at least. So maybe they came to the coastal area of Vietnam by the sea, actually. So that pleases a lot the Vietnamese today when we say that. But anyway, this is another question. And so in many objects, we find a relationship with maritime world. I mentioned Sri Lanka. Here we have another example from Ho Chi Minh City showing influence with Indonesia and some kind of the eastern coast of India. But you know, eastern coast of India and Indonesia have had close relationships. So it makes sense to have our Cham object, also a Lokeshvara Bodhisattva, in the middle of two other pieces, one from Java in the Rijksmuseum and one from India, belonging to the Pallava dynasty. And from time to time, the relationship with Cambodia are not far away neither, because in the early period, Cham people had difficult but sometimes deep relationship with Khmer people. They fight it, of course, a lot, but sometimes there were marriages. Well, you could say that marriage and fight is not absolutely without any kind of fling, but this is also another question. So here we have a beautiful Lokeshvara in bronze of the Museum of Vietnamese History, and it's interesting to link it to the well-known Prakan Chai or Sin Khao Plai Bat, should I say now, images that were found in Thailand several years ago. A huge amount of material I had no time to deal with, but it was so deeply published and well known that I thought it was maybe not necessary to go on with these. Actually, you have two images, one in Bangkok and one in Musée Guimet, belonging to that Prakan Chai discovery. I would like to know if the people who made these images were Khmer or Mon. This is not sure at all, actually, because we have no inscriptions. So it has always been considered as Khmer material, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they were Mon. And in Guimet, we were given a nice head fragment of a Lokeshvara, but a big head compared to the other bronzes that we find in Champa. Very unusual, but you can show also the connection between these objects and some Javanese art objects, and also back also to Western, but this time northern Western India, nowadays Bangladesh, and I'd like to mention here the importance and the beauty of these incredible Minamati images from Bangladesh. You know, we were supposed to show them in Musée Guimet several years ago, and the exhibition sadly was cancelled at the last moment, but these bronzes, thank heaven, came to our galleries for several weeks, so we could take pictures of them, and then they went back to Bangladesh, so that's the way it goes. But anyway, interesting relationship. Not the same, but bearing, you know, same kind of, some kind of traditions, let's say. And in Dongxiong, and I will finish with that because I took too much time, I knew I would, but Denise was very nice for me and said that it was not a problem, so I feel confident. I wanted to mention this incredible object that we were able to show in Musée Guimet in 2005 when we curated the Cham exhibition, a Buddha found in a famous Cham temple dating back to late 9th century. We have an inscription mentioning the date of 875. And in the Cham temple, together with a Mahayanic iconography, very interesting because it bears a lot of relationship together with China, and I had no time to deal with the Chinese question, but it should be the case for another lecture, actually. In the middle of the temple, they found that huge and beautifully preserved Buddha image, considered at first as a very early Dvaravati Buddhist image, but, and maybe the most ancient image ever found, you know, in Southeast Asia, blah, blah, blah. Well, pure masterpiece, but maybe not that ancient, because when we did the exhibition, my colleague Thierry Zephyr was able to link that sculpture to some Anuradhapura material dating back to a later, slightly later period, that is to say 8th to 9th century, and which was much more consistent with the date of the Cham temple itself. So what is interesting is to see that Cham people had direct, maybe, relationship with Buddhist monks of Sri Lanka, Were they monks, Sri Lankan monks traveling to Champa, or Cham people traveling to Ceylon? This is absolutely possible, of course, but when you look at these three images, the comparison seems very obvious to me. But of course, this is not only linked with continental Southeast Asia, and here you have that Buddha from Kalimantan Orientale, but I don't have to deal with this kind of Javanese material. And I would like to show you as the last image of, well, the last object of my presentation today, this beautiful and incredible lady that was found much later in the temple. And it was a pure miracle because she was found in Dongseong after the bombing of the temple. You know, there is nothing left there in Dongseong temple because of the war. But when they found mines and they wanted to clean the space, this beautiful statue was found. A Cham sculpture, of course, of a Buddhist iconography. We don't know exactly who she is, but she bears a Buddha in her hairstyle. She is linked to what is called Dongseong style in Cham art, but let's forget that. That is to say, she's linked to late 9th century, and that's all. But she can be linked in a way or another to several beautiful Buddhist images, such as this incredible Tara preserved in the British Museum. Of course, different traditions, different ways of expressing things, but I wouldn't be surprised if the artist who made the Cham sculpture hadn't seen a Sri Lankan piece such as this beautiful and incredible Tara. So I'm done with my presentation today. So you see it's a mixture of a little bit of this, a little bit of that, actually dealing with Southeast Asian art, but you know that much better than I do, I guess, is a little bit like making a cake or something like that. You know, when you have to add some different kind of spices to have the better taste. Actually, it worked that way at the time when all these objects were designed. They were never conceived as copies, but they wanted to pay homage to the beauties they were in touch with. And of course, the artists added their own spices, and that makes all this kind of material so interesting. Thank you for your attention.